The bustling streets of Capital City were alive with energy. It was mid-afternoon, and the sun cast long shadows over the towering buildings. The clamor of honking cars, street vendors shouting their wares, and children laughing echoed through the air. Among the sea of people moving along the sidewalks was 12-year-old David Okafor, a bright and curious boy whose caramel-toned skin reflected the sunlight. Dressed in his neatly ironed school uniform and carrying his small school bag, David exuded a sense of innocence and confidence as he made his way to the local convenience store. David's father, retired Chief Justice Raymond Okafor, was a household name in the country. He had spent decades reforming the legal system and fighting for the rights of the marginalized. However, Raymond had always shielded his family from the limelight, preferring a quiet life for them after retiring from the public eye. Inside the store, David carefully browsed the aisles. After finding the cookies, he picked up a soda as well, smiling at the thought of enjoying them during his afternoon study session. He walked to the counter, placed his items, and handed over his crumpled bills and coins to the cashier. As David stepped outside, his heart nearly stopped when a rough hand grabbed his arm. "Hey boy," a gruff voice barked. David turned to face a tall, broad-shouldered police officer with icy blue eyes that seemed to pierce through him. The man wore a crisp uniform with a badge that read Officer Michael Grayson. David froze, his voice trembling. "What's in the bag?" the officer demanded, pointing at David's school bag and the plastic bag in his hand. "My school books and the snacks I just bought," David replied, trying to keep calm. "Don't lie to me," Officer Grayson snapped, yanking the plastic bag from David's hand. "I saw you walking out of the store, and I know your kind, always stealing what doesn't belong to you." David's heart raced. People on the street began to stop and stare. Whispers rippled through the crowd, but no one stepped forward to intervene. "I didn't steal anything," David protested, tears welling in his eyes. "You can check. I paid for everything." But Grayson wasn't listening. He grabbed David's school bag and dumped its contents onto the pavement. Books, notebooks, and a pencil case tumbled out. The officer rummaged through them, his movements rough and deliberate, but he found nothing incriminating. "Don't play smart with me," Grayson growled, gripping David's arm tighter. "Where are the stolen items? I know you have them." The boy shook his head frantically. "I swear, I didn't steal anything. Please, let me go." By now, the crowd had grown larger. Among them was an elderly man, Mr. Obina, who had seen the boy pay for his snacks in the store. He stepped forward and tried to reason with the officer. "Excuse me, sir," Obina said, his voice steady but respectful. "I was in the store with the boy. I saw him pay for his items. He didn't steal anything." Grayson shot the old man a cold glare. "Stay out of this, old man. This is police business." David's heart sank further. The officer's grip on his arm was like a vice, and he felt completely powerless. "Please," he whispered, his voice barely audible. Grayson reached for his radio, preparing to call for backup, but before he could, a black SUV pulled up to the curb. The car's tinted windows rolled down, revealing a face that immediately commanded, "Respect Chief Justice Raymond Okafor." Raymond had been on his way to a charity meeting when he noticed the commotion. The sight of his son being manhandled by a police officer sent a wave of fury through him, but his years of experience taught him to keep his composure. Stepping out of the vehicle, his tall, regal frame exuded authority. Dressed in a tailored navy blue suit, he adjusted his tie and strode towards the scene with purpose. "Good afternoon, officer," Raymond said, his deep voice calm but firm. "May I ask what's going on here?" Grayson glanced at Raymond, unaware of who he was. "This boy was caught stealing. I'm about to take him in for questioning." Raymond's sharp eyes flicked to his son, who was visibly shaken, and then back to the officer. "Did you witness him stealing, or is this an assumption?" "I don't need to witness it," Grayson snapped. "It's obvious." Raymond's expression hardened. "Obvious, you say? Because he's a young black boy. The officer faltered for a moment, his confidence wavering. "Look, sir, I'm just doing my job." Raymond stepped closer, his tone now ice cold. "Your job, Officer Grayson, is to enforce the law with fairness and integrity, not to harass innocent children based on your prejudices." Grayson blinked, realization dawning on him. "Wait, who are you to tell me how to do my job?" Raymond reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his ID card, holding it up for the officer to see. The color drained from Grayson's face as he read the name. Justice Raymond Okafor, former Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. The crowd murmured in astonishment. "I suggest you release my son immediately," Raymond said, his voice low and commanding. Grayson's hand dropped from David's arm as if it had been burned. I didn't realize," he stammered. "You didn't realize because you didn't bother to look past your own bias," Raymond said. "This is unacceptable, and I will be filing a formal complaint." David ran into his father's arms, tears streaming down his face. "I didn't do anything wrong, Papa," he whispered. "I know, son," Raymond replied, holding him close, "and I'll make sure everyone else knows it too." The crowd began to disperse, some applauding Raymond for standing up to the officer. Grayson stood frozen, humiliated and unsure of what to do. Raymond guided David back to the SUV, but before they drove off, he turned to the officer one last time. "Remember this moment, Officer Grayson. Prejudice blinds justice, and when justice is blind, society suffers." As the car drove away, David sat silently, his mind racing. This incident would change his life in ways he couldn't yet imagine. David couldn't shake off the incident, even as his father drove him home. The echoes of Officer Grayson's harsh words reverberated in his mind. Sitting in the passenger seat, he stared out of the window, watching the city blur past, his thoughts a whirlwind of confusion and anger. "Papa," David finally said, breaking the silence. "Why did he think I was a thief?" "I didn't do anything." Raymond glanced at his son, his expression a mixture of sadness and determination. "Sometimes people make judgments based on how someone looks instead of who they are. David, it's wrong, but it's a reality we must face." "But why us? Why me?" Raymond sighed deeply. "Because we live in a world where ignorance still thrives. But remember, what happened today doesn't define you. Your actions, your character, and your truth are what matter." David nodded, though the explanation didn't make him feel any better. When they arrived home, his mother, Ada, was waiting at the door, her arms folded across her chest, her worry evident. "What happened?" Ada asked, rushing to embrace David. Raymond explained the ordeal, his voice calm but edged with simmering anger. Ada's eyes filled with tears as she listened, pulling David close. "My poor baby," she whispered. "No child should have to go through this." Later that evening, as David lay in bed, the events replayed in his mind. He couldn't understand why someone would hate him for something as simple as the color of his skin. He thought about his father's words and wondered how one man could carry the weight of fighting against such prejudice for so many years. The next morning, Raymond received a call from the police commissioner, who had heard about the incident. The commissioner, an old colleague of Raymond's, apologized profusely and assured him that Officer Grayson would face disciplinary action. "I appreciate your words," Raymond said, his voice steady. "But this is bigger than one officer. The system needs reform. Incidents like this are far too common." The commissioner agreed but offered little in terms of concrete action. Raymond hung up, his resolve to protect his family and fight for justice stronger than ever. At school, David's experience had become the talk of the playground. Some of his classmates rallied around him, expressing their outrage and offering support. Others, however, whispered cruel remarks, mocking him for bringing trouble to their quiet school. "Hey David," one boy sneered during lunch. "Did you steal my sandwich too? Or should I call the cops?" The words hit David like a slap. His fists clenched at his sides, but he remembered his father's advice. Never let anger control you. Instead, he walked away, though the sting of humiliation lingered. His only solace was his best friend, Emma, a sharp-witted girl who never hesitated to speak her mind. "Don't listen to them," she said firmly. "They're just jealous because you're smarter than all of them combined." David smiled faintly. "I wish it didn't bother me so much." "It's okay to feel hurt," Emma replied. "But one day, you're going to prove them all wrong. Just wait." Meanwhile, Officer Grayson sat in his small apartment, nursing a drink and replaying the confrontation in his mind. The humiliation of being publicly chastised by a retired Chief Justice gnawed at him. But deep down he also felt something else: guilt. He pulled out his phone and started reading about Raymond Okafor. The articles painted a picture of a man who had dedicated his life to fairness and equality, a man who had dismantled systems of injustice and inspired generations to fight for what was right. Grayson felt a pang of shame. As the days passed, the incident gained traction in the media. News outlets picked up the story, framing it as a stark example of racial profiling and systemic bias. Interviews with witnesses, including the elderly Mr. Obina, painted a damning picture of Grayson's actions. "That boy did nothing wrong," Obina told reporters. "He's a good kid, and his father is one of the most honorable men I've ever known. This should never have happened." The pressure mounted on the police department to take action. Protests erupted outside the station, led by activists demanding justice for David and accountability for Officer Grayson. One evening, as the family gathered for dinner, Raymond turned on the TV. The news was covering the protests, and David's face appeared on the screen. David Okafor, the son of retired Chief Justice Raymond Okafor, was falsely accused of theft by a police officer in what many are calling a blatant case of racial profiling. The reporter said. David shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "I didn't want all this attention," he murmured. "I know," Raymond said gently, "but sometimes we don't get to choose. What matters is how we respond." Ada placed a hand on her son's shoulder. "You're brave, David. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." Despite his parents' reassurances, David felt the weight of the situation pressing down on him. He wasn't sure he wanted to be the face of a movement, but he also didn't want to let his father down. That night, as he lay in bed, he thought about what he could do to make a difference. He didn't have all the answers, but one thing was clear: he wouldn't let this experience define him. The next morning, David woke up to the sound of distant chants and car horns. When he looked out his bedroom window, he saw a growing crowd outside his house. Protesters held signs that read, "Justice for David and End Racial Profiling Now." Meanwhile, the protests outside the police station continued to grow. Raymond, though retired, found himself pulled back into the public eye. He was invited to speak at a community forum about the incident and its broader implications. Standing at the podium in a packed auditorium, Raymond addressed the crowd. "What happened to my son is not an isolated incident. It's a symptom of a deeper problem, a system that judges people based on the color of their skin rather than the content of their character." The audience erupted in applause, but Raymond raised a hand to quiet them. "Change begins with accountability, but it doesn't end there. We must educate, legislate, and advocate for a society where every child, regardless of their background, feels safe and valued." As he spoke, David watched from the front row, his heart swelling with pride. For the first time since the incident, he felt a spark of hope. Back at the police station, Officer Grayson was feeling the heat. The department had launched an internal investigation, and his superiors were less than pleased with the media frenzy. Grayson sat in the interrogation room, facing a panel of senior officers. "Your actions have put this department in a difficult position," one of them said sternly. "What do you have to say for yourself?" Grayson shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "I made a mistake," he admitted, though the words felt foreign on his tongue. "But I was just doing my job." "Your job," another officer interjected, "is to serve and protect, not to profile and harass. This isn't the first complaint we've received about you, Grayson." Perhaps it's time to reconsider your place in this department. The hearing ended with no definitive conclusion, but Grayson knew his career was hanging by a thread. That evening, David and his family gathered in the living room to watch the news. Footage of the protests, interviews with activists, and clips from Raymond's speech dominated the coverage. David, Ada said gently, "How are you feeling about all this?" David hesitated before answering. "It's a lot, but I think I understand now. This isn't just about me. It's about everyone who's ever been treated unfairly." Raymond smiled, pride shining in his eyes. "That's the spirit, son. Remember, courage doesn't mean you're not afraid. It means you act despite the fear." David nodded, his resolve growing stronger. The protests outside the police station showed no signs of slowing down. Each day, the crowd seemed to grow larger, with people of all races and backgrounds joining together to demand justice. Chants of "no justice, no peace" echoed through the streets, creating a ripple of energy that spread across the city. David and his family watched the events unfold from their home. The media attention had brought reporters to their doorstep, and the constant presence of cameras and microphones made Ada uneasy. "Do you think this will ever end?" she asked Raymond one evening as they sat in the kitchen. "It will," Raymond replied, sipping his tea, "about ensuring a better future for David and every other child who looks like him." At school, David's resolve was being tested. Marcus and his gang continued to taunt him, but David had learned to ignore their remarks. However, the real challenge came in history class when the teacher, Mr. Peterson, decided to address the protests as part of a lesson on civil rights. Today, we'll be discussing the role of activism in bringing about social change. Mr. Peterson announced, "David, since your family has been at the center of recent events, would you like to share your perspective?" David froze, swallowing his nerves. He stood up. "I didn't ask for any of this," he began, his voice shaking slightly. "But if my story can help people see how wrong it is to judge someone based on their skin color, then I'm okay with it. This isn't just about me, it's about everyone who's ever been treated unfairly." The room was silent for a moment before Emma started clapping. One by one, the other students joined in, and soon the entire class was applauding. Marcus, sitting in the back, scowled but said nothing. Meanwhile, Officer Grayson found himself spiraling. The investigation into his actions had left him suspended without pay, and the media had painted him as a symbol of everything wrong with the police force. He spent most of his days in his small apartment, drinking and avoiding the outside world. One evening, as he flipped through news channels, he came across a segment featuring Raymond. "Accountability is not the end, it's the beginning," Raymond said, his tone measured but firm. "We must look at the structures that allow prejudice to thrive and work together to dismantle them." Grayson turned off the TV in frustration. He knew he had made a mistake, but the constant scrutiny was unbearable. For the first time, he began to question the biases he had carried for so long. Back at home, David found himself struggling with a new challenge, balancing his newfound role as a symbol of justice with his desire to just be a normal kid. One evening, as he worked on a school project in his room, his father knocked on the door. "Can I come in?" Raymond asked. "Sure," David replied, setting aside his books. Raymond sat on the edge of the bed, his expression thoughtful. "I've been thinking about everything that's happened," he began, "and I want you to know that it's okay to feel overwhelmed. You're just a boy. David, you don't have to carry the weight of the world on your shoulders." "But what if I want to?" David asked. "What if I want to make a difference?" Raymond smiled. "Then I'll support you every step of the way. But remember, making a difference doesn't always mean being in the spotlight. Sometimes, the most important work happens behind the scenes." David nodded, his father's words giving him a sense of clarity. As the protests continued, the community began to organize more structured efforts to address systemic racism. Town hall meetings were held, workshops on bias and inclusion were conducted, and petitions for policy changes circulated widely. Raymond was at the forefront of these efforts, often bringing David along to meetings and events. Though David was initially hesitant, he soon found himself inspired by the passion and determination of those around him. One evening, during a particularly lively town hall meeting, a young woman named Jasmine stood up to speak. "I'm here today because I believe in change," she said, her voice ringing with conviction. "But change doesn't happen overnight. It takes persistence, courage, and a willingness to face uncomfortable truths. We owe it to the next generation to do better." David listened intently, her words resonating deeply. He realized that the fight for justice wasn't just about one moment. It was about a lifetime of commitment. The turning point came when the police department announced that Officer Grayson would face a formal hearing to determine his future with the force. The news reignited the protests, with activists demanding not just disciplinary action, but broader reforms. On the day of the hearing, Raymond and David stood outside the courthouse, surrounded by a sea of supporters. As cameras flashed and reporters shouted questions, Raymond addressed the crowd. "This is not about vengeance," he said firmly. "It's about accountability, and it's about ensuring that no one else has to endure what my son went through." David stood beside his father, his heart pounding. He didn't know what the outcome of the hearing would be, but he knew that they were on the right side of history. The courthouse buzzed with tension. Inside the hearing room, Officer Grayson sat at a long table, flanked by his lawyer and a representative from the police union. Across the room, a panel of senior officers and city officials prepared to hear the case. Spectators filled the gallery, their faces a mix of curiosity, outrage, and hope. Raymond and David sat near the front, their presence a silent reminder of what had brought everyone here. David's heart raced as he glanced around, taking in the somber atmosphere. His father placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "Remember, David," Raymond whispered, "this is just one step in a much larger journey." The hearing began with opening statements. Grayson's lawyer argued that his actions were the result of a misunderstanding and claimed that his client had no intention of discriminating against David. Officer Grayson acted based on the information he had at the time. The lawyer said this was not about race, but about ensuring public safety. The statement drew murmurs of disapproval from the audience, but the panel urged everyone to remain quiet. When it was time for Raymond to speak, he rose from his seat, his towering presence commanding attention. He approached the microphone, his expression calm but resolute. "My son, David, was humiliated and wrongfully accused in broad daylight," he began, his voice steady. "This was not an isolated incident. It was the product of a system that allows bias to flourish unchecked." Officer Grayson's actions were not just a misunderstanding. They were a reflection of a deeper problem that we cannot ignore. Raymond's words hung in the air, resonating with the crowd. David watched his father in awe, inspired by his strength and eloquence. Outside the courthouse, the crowd of protesters swelled, their chants echoing through the streets. Emma had joined the demonstration, holding a handmade sign that read, "Justice for David, justice for all." "This is incredible," she said to one of the organizers. "I've never seen so many people come together like this." "It's because of David and his family," the organizer replied. "They've given us a reason to fight." Back inside, the hearing continued with testimonies from witnesses. Mr. Obina, the elderly man who had been at the grocery store, recounted the events of that day. "I saw the whole thing," he said, his voice trembling with emotion. "David did nothing wrong. He was just a boy trying to help me, and yet he was treated like a criminal." Next came Jasmine, the young activist who had spoken at the town hall meeting. She addressed the panel with unwavering confidence. "This isn't just about one boy or one officer," she said. "It's about a culture of prejudice that has gone unchecked for far too long. We need accountability, but we also need change." As the testimonies continued, Grayson's demeanor shifted. He had entered the hearing defensive, but now he looked increasingly uncomfortable. The weight of the evidence and the voices of those he had wronged was beginning to sink in. During a recess, David stepped outside to get some fresh air. He found a quiet spot near the edge of the crowd, watching the protesters from a distance. "You okay?" a voice asked. David turned to see Emma standing beside him, her sign tucked under her arm. "I don't know," he admitted. "It's all so much. I didn't think one moment could change so much." Emma smiled gently. "That's the thing about moments, they have power. And you've handled this better than most adults would." David chuckled, though his mind was still heavy with doubt. "What if nothing changes? Emma, what if all of this is for nothing?" "It won't be," she said firmly, "because you've already made a difference. Look at all these people, David. They're here because of you." Her words gave him a glimmer of hope, but the uncertainty lingered. When the hearing resumed, Officer Grayson was given the opportunity to speak. He stood slowly, his shoulders hunched under the weight of the moment. "I want to start by saying that I'm sorry," he began, his voice barely audible. "Sorry to David, to his family, and to everyone who's been affected by my actions." The room fell silent. Grayson took a deep breath before continuing. "I grew up in a world that taught me to see people like David as threats. I never questioned it, I just accepted it. But sitting here today, hearing all of you speak, I realize how wrong I've been. I don't deserve forgiveness, but I want to do better. I want to be part of the solution." His words were met with a mix of reactions. Some people nodded, acknowledging his vulnerability, while others remained skeptical. Raymond watched Grayson closely, his expression unreadable. He leaned over to David and whispered, "This is a start, but it's not the end." As the hearing drew to a close, the panel announced that they would deliberate and deliver their decision in the coming days. The room emptied, leaving Raymond, David, and Ada to reflect on everything that had unfolded. "How do you think it went?" David asked, his voice tinged with uncertainty. "I think the truth spoke louder than anything else," Raymond replied. "Now we wait and see what they decide." That night, David lay awake, staring at the ceiling. His mind raced with thoughts of the hearing, the protests, and the people who had come together to support him. For the first time, he began to understand the true power of community. He didn't know what the future held, but he was determined to keep fighting, not just for himself, but for everyone who had been silenced by prejudice. The days after the hearing were a blur of anticipation and nervous energy. The city held its breath as everyone waited for the panel's decision. Protests had slowed to a simmer, but the fight for justice remained alive. People in the community continued to rally, their voices louder than ever. David's life, once simple and carefree, had been irrevocably changed. He had become a symbol not just of the injustice he had faced, but of the hope that change was possible. Though the weight of the world still pressed down on his shoulders, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. It was on a crisp morning 2 weeks later that Raymond received the long-awaited phone call. David was sitting at the kitchen table, scrolling through his phone, when his father walked into the room, his face pale. "David," Raymond said quietly, "they've made their decision." David stood up quickly, his heart pounding in his chest. "What did they say? What happened?" Raymond paused, looking at his son with a mixture of pride and concern. "Officer Grayson has been officially terminated from the force." A wave of mixed emotions washed over David. He had known, deep down, that this was the likely outcome, but hearing it, knowing that the man who had wronged him would face consequences, was both a relief and a reminder of everything that had happened. "But that's not the end, son," Raymond continued. "There's still so much work to do. This is a small victory, but the fight for justice doesn't stop here." David nodded, understanding the truth in his father's words. The road ahead would be long, but it was a road worth walking. That afternoon, the city erupted into celebration. News outlets reported the panel's decision, and social media lit up with support from across the nation. Messages flooded in from strangers, activists, and community leaders, all expressing their solidarity with David and his family. "We did it," Emma said, her voice tinged with disbelief, as she hugged David. "You did it." David smiled, but there was a sadness in his eyes. "I couldn't have done it without everyone. This isn't just my fight, it's ours." The phone rang, and David picked it up to hear a familiar voice on the other end. "David, it's Officer Harris. I just wanted to say, we're proud of you." David paused, unsure how to respond. Harris had been one of the officers who had supported his family from the beginning, speaking out against Grayson's actions. "Thank you," David said quietly. I didn't expect that. It's the least we can do," Harris replied. "But this isn't just about one officer. It's about a system that needs to change. You've done something that most people are too afraid to do." The following weeks brought a whirlwind of interviews, speaking engagements, and meetings with community leaders. Raymond and David traveled to different cities, sharing their story and advocating for reform. David's voice was now one that resonated with people far beyond his hometown, his message of courage and accountability reaching audiences across the country. But with every speech, every event, the pressure began to build. David was no longer just a boy who had been wronged. He was now a public figure, carrying the weight of an entire movement on his shoulders. One evening, after returning from a rally, David sat alone in his room, staring out the window at the stars. He thought about his childhood, how simple it had been, how carefree. He missed those days. His phone buzzed on the desk, breaking his reverie. He picked it up to see a message from Emma. "You've changed the world, David, but don't forget to take care of yourself too." He smiled softly, texting back, "I will. Thank you for everything." The final turning point came when a major political figure reached out to the family. A senator from the state, who had been closely following David's case, requested a meeting. The senator was a strong advocate for police reform, and saw in David's story an opportunity to bring the issue of racial injustice to the national stage. At the meeting, the senator looked at David with a look of quiet admiration. "What you've done, young man, is no small thing. You've sparked a conversation that needs to be had." David nodded, grateful but humble. "It's not just me," he said. "It's everyone who's ever faced this kind of injustice. This is just the beginning." Months passed, and the national conversation on racial injustice continued to evolve. David's case was no longer an isolated incident. It had become part of a broader movement, a call for reform that was slowly but surely taking root across the country. Though life had changed dramatically for David, one thing remained constant: his commitment to the cause. He continued to speak out, to push for justice. But he also found moments of peace with his family, appreciating the love and support that had carried him through. The protests had subsided. The media had moved on to other stories. But David knew that the fight was far from over. He also knew that, no matter where life took him, he would always carry the lessons he had learned. The world might never be perfect, but change was possible, and he had seen it with his own eyes. He had not only changed the course of his own life, but had also paved the way for future generations to come. And as David sat with his father one evening, watching the sunset from their porch, he realized that the true victory was not in the outcome of the hearing or the media coverage, but in the hope he had sparked in others. Hope that, no matter the odds, people could rise up and demand a better world. With his father by his side and his community behind him, David knew that they had taken the first step toward a future where justice was not just an ideal, but a reality. The journey was far from over, but it was a journey worth taking.